6.5 Develop Schedule. Develop schedule is the process of analysing activity sequences, durations, resource requirements and schedule constraints to create a schedule model for project execution and monitoring and controlling. The key benefit of this process is that it generates a schedule module with planned dates for completing project activities. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs, tools and techniques and outputs of this process are depicted in figure 614. That's PMBOK Guide, page 305. This lesson is concerned with creating the project schedule, which, like most other project management activities, is an iterative process. The schedule model is used to determine the planned start and finish dates of project activities and milestones based on the best available information. And as you create it, you'll often find that certain activities just won't fit, or they seem too long or even too short. If an activity appears to be too short, it may be that you've overlooked something. For these and other reasons, you will probably find yourself reviewing and revising duration estimates as a result of this process, which could even lead to going back to the scope and revising the entire scope too. If you watch a house being built, one of the first activities is to measure up the land and hammer in a few wooden pegs into the ground to mark the corners of the foundation, then later work out what needs to happen within the pegs. And with just those pegs in the ground, you can get a rough overview of the whole house. So if you imagine your schedule is like a building site, you pick up a few pegs called milestones and hammer them in to the schedule to mark when the main events will occur. Then you will work out how you will fit in the various activities between the pegs. And with those milestones in the schedule, you can get a rough overview of the whole project. Activities are added to a schedule by entering the start and end dates, and once people have been assigned to activities, you can ask them to review their activities just to make sure that they understand how to proceed, that the time duration seems reasonable and there's no conflict with resource calendars. But they can also report back if there's any apparent issues, or they may even know a better way to perform the activity which could save time and/or resources or reduce risk. Revising and maintaining the project schedule model to sustain a realistic schedule continues throughout the duration of the project. Develop schedule inputs. Number 1, the project management plan. Project management plan components include the schedule management plan. This schedule management plan identifies the scheduling method and tool used to create the schedule and how the schedule is to be calculated. Scope baseline. The scope baseline equals a scope statement plus work breakdown structure baseline plus a work breakdown structure dictionary baseline. They contain details about the project deliverables that are considered when building the schedule module. Number 2, project documents. Project documents that can be considered as inputs for this process include activity attributes. These can hold a lot of information about activities and the interdependencies. Activity list. This is the chart created as an add-on to the work breakdown structure, identifies all the activities to be included in the schedule module. Assumption log. Assumption log contains records of the assumptions that may give rise to individual project risks and may impact the project schedule. Basis of estimates. The amount and type of individual details supporting duration estimates vary by application area. Regardless of the level of detail, the supporting documents should provide a clear and complete understanding of how those duration estimates were derived. Duration estimates. These contain the quantitative assessments of the likely number of work periods that will be required to complete an activity. Lessons learned, as always, can help you develop a schedule model with the benefit of hindsight. Milestone list. These are the first events to be entered into the schedule model, I should say. Project schedule network diagrams. The project schedule network diagrams contain the logical relationships of predecessors and successors that will be used to calculate the schedule. These are the finish to start, start to start, and finish to finish relationships we covered in the previous lesson. You'll probably never use a start to finish relationship. In fact, the only time you're likely to encounter a start to finish relationship is in the exam. Project team assignments specify which resources are assigned to each activity. Resource calendars contain information on the availability of the resources during the project. Resource requirements identify the types and quantities of resources required for each activity. Risk register details all identified risks and their characteristics that affect the schedule model. Risk information relevant to the schedule is reflected in schedule reserves using the expected or mean risk input. Input number 3, agreements. By agreement, the PMBOK guide means contractual type agreements with vendors, but as well as the vendors, it can also be agreements within the organisation as well. And as the vendors will be producing deliverables, it makes sense to let them provide input on the schedule. Number 4, enterprise environmental factors, and these will be government or industry standards and communications channels. Input number 5, organisational process assets, will include scheduling methodology containing the policies governing schedule model development and maintenance, and project calendars to see when people and equipment are available and when not. For example, you may need to use a concrete pump at a certain time, so you check the resource calendar only to discover it is off on vacation at the same time. Develop schedule tools and techniques. Number 1, schedule network analysis. Schedule network analysis is a combination of a range of techniques used to generate the project schedule model. Schedule network analysis includes critical path method, resource optimization techniques, modeling techniques, aggregate schedule reserves to produce the probability of a schedule slip when the project paths converge at a single point in time, or when multiple paths diverge from a single point in time to reduce the probability of schedule slip. Reviewing the network to see if the critical path has high risk activities or long lead times that could necessitate use of schedule reserves or the implementation of risk responses to reduce the risk of critical path. Schedule network analysis is an iterative process that is employed until the viable schedule model is developed. But even after it's developed, it will be reviewed and updated throughout the project. Number 2, critical path method, CPM. Question: the critical path is A, the longest path through the project, B, the shortest path through the project, C, the difference between the late finish and the early start, D, the difference between the late start and early finish. Answer is A, the longest path of the project. This one may not be immediately obvious because you want to finish the project in the shortest time possible. You might think you would want to take the shortest path. But when you think about it, if the critical path is not the longest path, then you could delay one of the activities on it without delaying the whole project. So by definition, if you can delay any deliverable on the critical path, then the entire project is delayed by this amount. The critical path is the longest in terms of sequenced activities, but the shortest in terms of total project duration. But this represents the shortest time to complete the project. With added activities to the schedule, it is common to assume that there are no resource limitations. Once all the activities have been added, you need to do 2 sets of calculations. The critical path method is used to estimate the minimum project duration and determine the amount of schedule flexibility on the logical network paths within the schedule model. This is achieved by, first of all, doing a forward pass, then a backward pass. The purpose of performing a forward pass on the schedule model is to calculate the earliest time each activity in the network can start and finish and the minimum overall duration of the project. The purpose of performing a backward pass on schedule model is to calculate the latest time that each activity in the network can start and finish and still maintain the minimum overall duration of the project as calculated by the forward pass. After that, the calculations get a bit tricky. The good news is that all schedule applications perform all these calculations automatically for you. The bad news is that in the examination you have to perform them all yourself manually. There are 2 ways to perform CPM calculations, called day 0 and day 1. Many project managers argue about which is better, although they arrive at the same result. I prefer to use day 0 method, however, the PMBOK guide explains the day 1 method, and so I will do the same to avoid confusion. You can see an example of CPM calculations in figure 6.16. The things to note are, although it's called day 1, the units can be days, hours or weeks. The project still starts on day 1, which is the first day of the project and not a calendar date because it hasn't been worked out yet. So if your project starts on June 11, December 31 or February 29, the first activity in your CPM will still be day 1. Let's have a look at figure 616. Activity A, the first activity, where did the numbers come from? Each time we add an activity, we write the activity name in the middle, then the early start date in the top left corner. For our first activity, this will always be 1 as explained earlier. Then we write the activity duration in top center, and just in case you don't know, we actually have to do this in the exam. Then we write the early finish date in the top right corner, which is early start plus duration minus 1. So 1 plus 5 minus 1 equals 5. We don't write anything in the bottom fields yet because we are performing what is known as a forward pass, and so we're moving from left to right, just filling in the top fields. Now that we've completed activity A, we move to activity B. We never have fractional work units in the diagram, so we can't have one activity starting on the same time as a predecessor activity ends. It must always start at least 1 unit later. Activity A ended at 5, so the early start for activity B is 6. Note that if an activity has multiple successors, they will all have the same early start. With activity B, the early start is 6, and again we write in the duration, which is 5 again, and so the late finish is 6 plus 5 minus 1 equals 10. Then the early start for activity D is 10 plus 1 equals 11. Duration is 15, and so early finish should be 11 plus 15 minus 1 equals 25. But if we look at activity D, all the figures are higher. Why is that? It's because we haven't considered activity C yet, and when we do, we overwrite the values in activity D if the new results are higher, otherwise we leave them. Because in the forward pass, we're calculating the earliest time each activity in the network can start and finish. When we calculate path A to B to D, the earliest finish date for the project was 25. But when we consider activity C, we realise that it can't be finished that early because activity C tends to push it out. This means that path A to B to D is not the longest path of the project, and so from what I said previously, path A to B to D is not the critical path. When we add in activity C, we get an early start and early finish of 16 and 30. And we overwrite the previous values in activity D. The critical path is a sequence of activities that represents the longest path to the project, which determines the shortest possible project duration. And the total float on the critical path is usually 0. These details will appear in examination questions too. Next we perform a backward pass, and that will tell us the latest each activity can start and finish without increasing the overall project duration. And this will also reveal the amount of float that each activity has. Our next question is, how many critical paths can a project have? A, 0, B, 1, C, 2, D, more than 2. The correct answer is D, more than 2. In fact, a project may have any number of critical paths, but all critical paths must be exactly the same length. The critical path method is used to calculate the critical path or paths and the amount of float and free float or schedule flexibility on the logical network paths within the schedule model. On my network path, the total float or schedule flexibility is measured by the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project finish date or violating a schedule constraint. A critical path is normally characterized by 0 total float on the critical path. As implemented with the precedence diagramming method sequencing, critical paths may have positive, 0 or negative total float depending upon the constraints applied. Positive total float is caused when the backward pass is calculated from a schedule constraint that is later than the early finish date that has been calculated during the forward pass calculation. Negative total float is caused when the constraint on the late dates is violated by duration and logic. Negative float analysis is a technique that helps to find possible accelerated ways of bringing a delayed schedule back on track. These are all important definitions for the examination. Schedule networks may have multiple near-critical paths. A near-critical path is a path that could become critical if an activity on the critical path is delayed. Let's do a backward pass now to calculate the float. When we performed the forward pass, we started with the early start date and the first activity. I then moved left to right. So now you can probably guess that for the backward pass, we start from the late finish of the last activity and move from right to left. But how do we know the late finish of activity D? That's easy because it's always the same as the early finish. This time we calculate the late start as follows. Late start equals late finish minus duration plus 1, 30 minus 15 plus 1 equals 16. And to calculate the activity float, we can either use the left hand side, late start minus early start, or the right hand side, late finish minus early finish. This will give exactly the same result. And we can write the float in the center of the bottom field, which in this case of the final activity is always 0. To go back to a predecessor, the late finish of the predecessor is the late start of the activity minus 1. Note that if an activity has multiple predecessors, they will all have the same late finish. I'll let you work through the rest of the other ones. What is the difference between free float and total float? Free float is the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed without delaying the early start date of any successor or violating a schedule constraint. Total float is the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project finish date or violating a schedule constraint. For example, the free float for activity B in figure 16 is 5 days. And because activity B is the only activity that is not on the critical path, then the total float will be the same as the free float. Tool technique number 3, resource optimization. Resource optimization is used to adjust the start and finish dates of activities to adjust planned resources use to be equal to or less than the resource availability. Examples of resource optimization techniques that can be used to adjust the schedule model due to demand and supply of resources include resource leveling, which is a technique in which start and finish dates are adjusted based on resource constraints with the goal of balancing the demand for resources with the available supply. Resource leveling can be used when shared or critically required resources are available only at certain times or in limited quantities or are over allocated, such as when a resource has been assigned to 2 or more activities during the same time period. As you can see in the top half of figure 6.17, Sue has been assigned to activity A and activity B, which are planned to run at the same time. Resource leveling can also be used when there's a need to keep resource usage at a constant level. Resource leveling can often cause the original critical path to change because it uses available float for leveling resources. Resource smoothing, a technique that adjusts the activities of a schedule model such that the requirements for resources on the project do not exceed certain predefined resource limits. In resource smoothing, as opposed to resource leveling, the project's critical path is not changed and the completion date may not be delayed. In other words, activities may only be delayed within their free and total float. Resource smoothing may not be able to optimize all resources. Please remember the differences between the two for the exam. Tool and technique number 4, data analysis. Data analysis techniques can be used for this process include what-if scenario analysis. This is a process of evaluating scenarios in order to predict their effect, positive or negative, on project objectives. Simulation. Whenever you see the word simulation on an exam, expect to see Monte Carlo in the answer and vice versa. It is used to determine ranges of start and end dates and ranges of possible critical paths and their probability of finishing on certain dates. Turn to technique number 5, leads and lags, which we've mentioned before. Leads are used in limited circumstances to advance a successor activity with respect to the predecessor activity. The lags are used in limited circumstances where processes require a set period of time to elapse between the predecessor and successors without work or resource impact. Tool and technique number 6, schedule compression. Schedule compression techniques are used to shorten or accelerate the schedule duration without reducing the project scope in order to meet schedule constraints, imposed dates, or other schedule objectives. A helpful technique is a negative float analysis. The critical path is the one with the least float. Due to violating a constraint or imposed date, the total float can become negative. Schedule compression techniques are compared in figure 619. They include crashing. Please note for the exam, crashing is a technique used to shorten the schedule duration for the least incremental cost by adding resources. They're key things to remember. The usual way to crash a project is to add more resources. Overtime is considered crashing because you're making the same person available additional times in the same work period, and so is equivalent to adding more people. Another way is to pay more to have activities on the critical path completed sooner. This may be achieved by using overtime or by outsourcing all or part of the activity or by using more experienced resources. But you need to do your research to ensure that crashing will actually work. Fast tracking. Please note for the exam, fast tracking is a technique used to shorten the schedule duration by performing in parallel activities or phases normally done in sequence. This increases risk by inducing dependencies, which is important for the exam. For example, a house is being built and the bathroom is on the critical path. The room is to be plastered and then tiled. Suppose it takes 4 hours to plaster each wall and 4 hours to tile each wall. The total time will be 16 hours plus 16 hours equals 32 hours. To fast track the process, these activities can be overlapped. When the plasterer finishes the first wall, the tiler will start to tile the first wall as the plaster starts working on wall 2, and so on. This means the tiling activity will have a lead of 12 hours over the plastering activity, and it reduces the theoretical time to 16 plus 4 hours equals 20 hours. But if the plaster slows down or runs out of materials, the tiler must slow down or stop too. Not all activities can be performed in parallel. For example, with the bathroom activity example, the plasterer and the tiler may be the same person. The tiler may not be available 12 hours early. The plaster may take longer than 4 hours to cure before it can be tiled. The bathroom may be too small for 2 people to work in, and so on and so on. And in both of these techniques, please note that the activities should be on the critical path, because if they're not on the critical path, you're not going to reduce the overall project duration. Tool and technique number 8, agile release planning. In this type of project, the high-level summary timeline of the release schedule is produced, typically covering a 3 to 6 month period, and is based on the product roadmap and the product vision of the product's evolution. Agile release planning also determines the number of iterations or sprints in a release and allows the product owner and team to decide how much needs to be developed and how long it would take to have a releasable product based on business goals, dependencies and impediments. Since features represent value to the customer, the timeline provides a more easily understood project schedule as it defines which features will be available at the end of each iteration, which is exactly the depth of information the customer is looking for. Develop schedule outputs. Number 1, schedule baseline. We now have our official start and end dates for the project. They will change, of course, but as this is a baseline, that is, it has been formally approved, it can be changed only through formal change control procedures, and is used as a basis of comparison to actual results. I was working as a senior project manager with a large organisation, and the senior management decided they would bring in a project management consultant as a second pair of eyes because of the high visibility, high value and importance of the project. The consultant, the senior manager and I had our first meeting. I started talking about setting up change controls so we could change the baselines for approved changes. The consultant, who I might add was paid over 4 times my salary, looked absolutely shocked and barked out, "That's rubbish. Once you create your baselines, they are set in concrete. You must ever change a baseline." I responded that changing the baseline to reflect reality was one of the most basic principles of project management. The consultant got to waving his arms around and challenged my project management knowledge and abilities, but I said that if we accept a change which adds more activities and changes the start and end dates and maybe extends the project end date, we need to be able to track against those new details rather than the old ones. It makes no sense to track against something which is now demonstrably wrong. But the consultant argued that all projects go wrong, and the reason you never change baselines is so when it does go badly wrong, you can present the baselines to prove it wasn't your fault and all the problems were caused by the customer. It was total rubbish, but management was paying him 4 times my salary, so they concluded that he must be right. We couldn't track anything in that project after the first few changes were approved. We set up translation charts and tried to allow for all sorts of changes without changing the baselines. It was a total mess. I left after a short while. The organisation, a large organisation, no longer exists. The consultant killed it off with his bad advice, and he's probably still been paid 4 times my salary to cause disasters elsewhere. Your baselines must reflect reality. They must reflect your approved changes. Output number 2, project schedule. The project schedule is an output of the schedule module that presents linked activities with planned dates, durations, milestones and resources. Now, in case you're a bit confused by this 2-step process, using the CPM network to create a schedule model, then transferring the schedule model to a schedule, is because your scheduling software does them both for you at once, automatically behind the scenes, but it's actually doing these 2 processes. This process usually occurs no later than the completion of the project management plan. The level of detail in the final schedule depends on the project. It might be a high-level summary, a milestone schedule, or a detailed schedule. However, the full detail is always maintained in the CPM network. It's just the schedule that may not have the full detail. A Gantt chart is the most common representation of a project schedule. Output number 3, schedule data. The schedule data for the project schedule model is a collection of information for describing and controlling the schedule. The schedule data includes, at a minimum, the schedule milestones, schedule activities, activity attributes, the documentation of all identified assumptions and constraints. Output number 4 is the project calendars. Project calendar identifies working days and shifts that are available for schedule activities and may be updated by this process. Number 5, change requests. Change requests may be raised for changes to the project scope or project schedule. If these changes are approved through the Perform Integrated Change Control process, they will result in changes to the scope baseline and or other components of the project management plan. Output number 5, project management plan updates. Any changes to the project management plan go through the organization's change control process via a change request. Components that may require a change request for the project management plan include the schedule management plan, because the plan may be updated to reflect a change in the way the schedule was developed and will be managed. The cost baseline for changes to the cost baseline that were incorporated in response to approved changes in scope, resources or cost estimates. Output number 5, project document updates. Project documents that may be updated as a result of carrying out this process include activity attributes, the assumptions log, duration estimates, lessons learned register, resource requirements, and the risk register. The risk register may be needed to update or reflect new or changed opportunities or threats perceived during scheduling assumptions. And that finally brings us to the end of Develop Schedule. The next lesson, 6.6 Control Schedule, is also the last lesson in this module. And please read the corresponding chapter in the PMBOK guide before watching the video, and that way you'll maximize the amount of learning from this video. Thank you.